Joining us now is Marc, a key advisor to Mike Pence, who also served as his chief of staff in the White House. So, Marc, Donald Trump, as we know, won't be at the debate tonight, but he is dominating in the field. In a new CBS News poll, he is ahead by 30 points in Iowa. Pence is at 5%, and he's winning by 37% in New Hampshire with his former VP at just 2%. How does Pence break through and change the dynamic of this race, and when does it become too late?
Well, Pamela, I don't think it's anywhere near being too late. I think that most voters are focused on the cost of inflation. They're focused on raising their families, and I think tension really turns later this fall. So I think you've seen that in Iowa, whether or not that was Barack Obama coming from behind the last minute to defeat Hillary, or on the Republican side with Santorum, or with Huckabee. So I think that's been the trajectory, and I think that people in Iowa want to know you. They want to see you. They want to meet with you. And I think there's a question whether or not Donald Trump's going to spend the time getting to know Iowa voters. So I think there's a long pathway. But for your question about the course, I think for the former vice president, this is a perfect setting to remind Americans that he's always been the full spectrum conservative, and perhaps the only one on the stage tonight who's represented that classical conservative viewpoint of limited government, strong national defense, and strong family values throughout his career. And this is a great setting for him to do that tonight.
But is that where the Republican Party is right now? I mean, when you think of Donald Trump being the front runner, I mean, when you say this is the party of Donald Trump, is what you just listed really where the party is?
Well, I think you know that the former vice president gave a speech a couple weeks ago defining conservatism versus populism. But I think it's important to break that down and to showcase that Donald Trump governed as a conservative president when the vice president was by his side. But since they separated, you've seen Donald Trump now propose, I think, the largest tax increase possible on middle-class Americans with a 10% across-the-board tariff. You've seen him advocate and walk away from his commitment to life. You've seen his positions change on fiscal sanity and basically embrace the position of Joe Biden to say we don't need to address entitlements, even though we're now at $33 trillion in debt. And so I think that there has been a diversion of paths, and I think that it's important that voters recognize that and understand the choice that they're facing.
Well, we should also note when Donald Trump was president, he also added trillions in debt. I know that Pence is steadfast in his conviction that he did the right thing on January 6th, but the bottom line is a large portion of the Trump base, Pence needs to win for the nomination, believes that the 2020 election was stolen and blames Pence. Do you really believe that he can win their support?
I think that as more and more Americans are informed of what the vice president's role was, they accept that the vice president doesn't have the authority to overturn the election, Pamela. And I think that most conservatives wouldn't want Kamala Harris to have that authority in 2024. And so I think that most elections, though, are also about the future. And I think they want to hear what's the vision for how we're going to get this country back on track. And so I think that's what tonight's debate's more about.
All right. I want to get your reaction to something former Trump White House aide Cassidy Hutchinson said about Trump's action on January 6th in her book. Quote, "The president is yelling. What's he saying? I can't make it out. I hear him say hang repeatedly. Hang, hang? What's that about? Suddenly everything makes sense. They're calling for the vice president to be hanged. The president is okay with it. He doesn't want to do anything. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong. He thinks Mike is a traitor." Your reaction, Marc?
Pamela, I think you know that on the day and night of January 6th that I was with the vice president of the Capitol. I'm not aware of what was happening back at the White House. I know the vice president had a job to do, and even though they attempted to evacuate him 3 times, he said, "I'm going to stay at my post and do my job to make sure that the votes of the American people are counted." And so I don't know what was happening back at the White House and can't really comment on Cassidy's recollection of those events.
Cassidy also said in her book that she remained loyal to Trump even after January 6th. Mike Pence even wrote in his book, quote, "I've always been loyal to President Trump." Marc, you worked in the Trump administration twice, and I'm wondering, as you reflect, did you also grapple with your loyalty to Trump, and what drives that?
I think that Donald Trump had a great record as president. I think he accomplished some great things for conservatives. But I think the events of January 6th, Pamela, are a demarcation line. I think that we all, as public officials, swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. And his decision on that day was to violate the Constitution, ask his vice president to disregard his oath to the Constitution. And I think that's a pretty significant.
But he was also doing that
barrier.
leading up
So
to
I
January
certainly
6th.
support.
I mean, he was, as you know, there were all kinds of discussions with the vice president, and he was saying the election, the election was going to be rigged and so forth. I mean, he'd been saying that all along.
And Pamela, I think that history will record one day a lot of conversations the vice president had over those 4 years in which, fortunately, he listened to Mike Pence's advice. Unfortunately, on that particular day, he didn't. And so no, I'm proud of the record of those 4 years, but I think that the events of January 6th were a very significant breach of one's oath to the Constitution. And as I've said, I think since those times, you've seen Donald Trump continue to veer off course and no longer promise conservatives what he did in 2016 when he promised he would govern as a conservative. He makes no such promise today. He asked his voters to basically fight his grievances.
All right, Marc Short, nice to have you on. Thank you.
Pamela, thanks for having me.